security operations at Utah Education Network. Been there for a couple years now. And I've been doing pen testing and red teaming for several years now. So I'm here to talk to you about man-in-the-middle techniques as part of your pen tests or red team engagements, and then just to raise some awareness of what is possible as far as performing this type of attacks. Before continue, I do want to mention that this is my favorite thing to do when I'm doing pen testing and red teaming, and it's one of the reasons why I actually got into it to start. I always found it intriguing that, you know, when you connect to a network, that there is a possibility of, you know, somebody else or hopefully not a real hacker intercepting your traffic, and then without of you knowing, right? Just generally, I'm coming from a networking networking background, and networks are built to work, right? So you want to trust your network, you want to plug in your computer into it, and then ensure that your traffic has integrity and that, you know, nobody can snoop with it or do anything bad to it, right? So, well, unfortunately, that's not the case, and there is still plenty of possibilities to apply this type of attacks when you're connected on to the local area network. So that's what I'm going to be talking about today. I do want to say that since this is only a 30 minutes presentation, I will try to go through all of the material and then leave a few minutes at the end for the questions. So just in the interest of time, I'll go through all of the slides, and then you can ask questions at the end. Also, just as far as the scope of this talk, I will be talking about scenarios that are relevant to the internal wired network. So no wireless in this case. I'll do mention wireless briefly. And then gaining the access to your internal network to apply man-in-the-middle type attacks is not a scope of this presentation. So it's assumed that an attacker or red teamer can actually plug in a device on your network and then run the attack from a rogue device. There are plenty of techniques to be able to achieve that kind of situation, so we're not going to get into details. I do want to get into details about what can you do once when you're connected to someone's network, right? So the focus is also on IPv4 attacks. IPv6 is also relevant, but I'm not going to spend too much time on it, as we all still pretty much live in IPv4 based world, right? And then lastly, as far as the introduction goes, we'll be talking a lot about ARP protocol misuse, and I'll be sure that I explain how ARP works and what are its security deficiencies that lead towards these abilities of being able to perform man-in-the-middle attacks. So before I get into the actual material, did want to put these slides from with a quote that most of you are probably familiar with. It's kind of related to Kali Brand in a way. It says, the quieter you become, the more you're able to hear. And I do want to say from a personal experience that when you're doing pen testing, you definitely want to stay as quiet and as stealthy as you can be. That buys you a lot, right? That if the blue team does not notice your activities, right, you can go a long ways doing mischievous stuff, right? Hopefully blue team catches the real attackers, right? But a lot of times when you're doing the pen testing assessments, you realize what is the power of, you know, being completely unheard while you're doing your activities. So a lot of times these activities, you know, can be done during the day, during your busiest time, but also by the nature of things, we do work at night as well. And at that point, it's being stealthy becomes even more prominent, right? Because everyone's else asleep. Okay, so the structure of the presentation I want to split into 4 different parts, actually 3 main sections, and then questions and answers for the end. I'll start with what section, in which I'm going to explain ARP protocol and the security deficiencies that come with it. And that's basically just going to be more of an intro, and then into the problem that creates man-in-the-middle possibilities. And then so what is, now that we know how to exploit ARP, what are different methods of running man-in-the-middle attacks. And then now what section will be what I'm going to conclude with. I'll share some red team versus blue team thoughts. Okay, so starting with the what section, and do want to read the ARP definition from Wikipedia. The address resolution protocol is a communication protocol used for discovering the link layer address, such as MAC address associated with a given internet layer address, which is typically IPv4 address. I know this sounds pretty fancy, but what it is, ARP is basically used at the most fundamental level to resolve MAC address from your IPv4 address, because all of your local area networks, or just about all of them, work based on doing switching and using MAC addresses to perform switching, and not IP addresses. So when you give IP address to a layer 2 device such as switch, it's not going to know what to do with it. So when you have 2 devices connected through a switch and they're communicating to one another from one IP to another, the switch actually does not do anything with those IP addresses. It needs to know what the MAC addresses are, which is a layer 2 term, to be able to communicate between the 2 IP addresses. So that's where ARP comes into the play. Basically, it's a translation from layer 3 to layer 2 to make sure that 2 computers on a local area network can communicate. All right, so I'm going to have a little video of how ARP actually operates here. So you have a switch here that's in the middle. That's a layer 2 device. And repeating, it's using MAC addresses to actually switch and the traffic. So the node A in this case wants to communicate to node D. And before it even starts to send any traffic to it, it's going to ask for its MAC address, right? The way it does that, it sends ARP broadcast message that goes to all of the nodes on the network. And I'm going to slow down this for a second. So when that broadcast happens, all of the workstations on the network have heard the broadcast message and basically are looking to respond to the query that came from the workstation A that is asking for a workstation D MAC address, right? In the broadcast message, the workstation A was asking for the corresponding MAC to 192.168.1.14 address, which belongs to the host D. And so both host C and B will see that that's not their IP address and will just discard the message. So I'll let it come back to the same spot. Okay, so again, host A is asking for the MAC address of the host D. It's sending an ARP broadcast message. It goes to all of the nodes. The B and C ignore it and discard the packet that arrived, and then host D will actually confirm that it owns that .114 address, and it's going to ship the MAC address back to the requester, in this case host A, and that response message comes back as a unicast, and as a result, host A will update its ARP cache. So every time when it needs to communicate with the host D in future, it will know how. So it doesn't need to go back through the same process. That is how ARP operates. So in summary, it resolves your layer 3 to layer 2 information, so IPv4 to MAC addresses. It is ancient protocol. Like, it's basically been in place ever since networking started, ever since the initial network started as layer 2 domains, And then when we started connecting between the networks and using IPv4, that's when the ARP was actually born, as it needed to perform that function to, stitch the layer 3 to layer 2. Also, it relies on a broadcast, so by nature of things, all of the nodes that are connected to the same network will hear ARP messages, and it's being cached locally on nodes themselves, right? So the big issue with ARP is that it does not come with a built-in authentication, meaning that anyone can connect to your local area network and listen to ARP queries and then respond to them. Now, whether they provide a legitimate response or not, that's a different thing, right? So in the early days, security was not as much of a need, I guess it's good to say. And so the authentication type mechanism has not been developed, right? So it was just assumed that nobody would abuse it, right? Which turned out not to be the case. And even still to these days, we're able to abuse ARP to run all sorts of attacks, right? So the fact that there's no authentication makes ARP vulnerable to ARP cache poisoning, and which is what I'm going to be explaining in more details in upcoming slides. So another Wikipedia definition, ARP cache poisoning is a technique by which an attacker sends spoofed ARP messages onto a local area network. Generally, the aim is to associate the attacker's MAC address with the IP address of another host, such as default gateway, causing any traffic meant for that IP address to be sent to the attacker instead. So this is actually what happens. When you have a red teamer or a pen tester connect to your local network, they abuse ARP by sending the spoofed messages to take over your IP address, basically. And I have an animation here, so you will see the attacker in red connected to the same layer 2 switch, and then you have that same workstation A, which in this case, it's looking to resolve its gateway's MAC address so it can actually communicate to the world, right? So as part of normal operations, host A would remember the gateway's MAC address, and the gateway will remember the host A MAC address, right? And the traffic will flow through your default gateway to the internet and back, and attacker would not have visibility to it at all. So what attacker does is, I'm going to start this animation here. It sends two messages. It sends one message first to host A, and it poisons its ARP cache. And it's basically telling it, hey, I'm your gateway. And then it's sending the other message to the gateway and saying, hey, I am the host A, right? So now both of these devices just blindly remember those resolutions from IP to MAC into their cache, and the traffic flows from host A to the switch to the attacker and then out to the world, right? So now attacker can see that side of things. Also for the return traffic will first get to the attacker and then be delivered to host A. In essence, this is how ARP cache poisoning works. And now you have attacker between you and the rest of the resources that are outside of your local area network, which in all reality is pretty much 95+% of your traffic, right? So anytime you're accessing websites, anytime you're accessing email, file sharing, et cetera, that traffic goes outside your default gateway. And because attacker has poisoned the default gateway ARP, he will be able to see all of your traffic in both directions. All right, so I'm going to move into some pre-recorded videos of the actual attacks. And I do want to say, I have about 4 or 5 videos or so that are more fundamental. There's some more advanced techniques that I'm not going to have time to cover in this presentation, but I will mention them at the end, right? So the most rudimentary way to do ARP poisoning is by using a Linux package that exists on Kali. It's called ARPSPOOF. It's part of the DSNF toolkit, and it's been around for probably 20 years or so. I apologize for not being specific, but I think that's probably good enough for the point, right? So the way this works is, so I have Kali Linux on the screen, and on the left side of the screen, there are 2 terminals that will actually be performing ARP poisoning. And then on the right side, there is the victim machine, which is Windows, and I have its terminal pulled up there, right? And then that's on the bottom right. And then on the top right, I will be doing some packet capture on the attacker's machine to show how after the ARP poisoning happens, attacker sees your traffic, right? Okay, so let's keep going with that. So what happens here, I'm typing ipconfig, so you can see the IP address on the victim machine. It's to the bottom right. And that's that .99 host, right? It's connected to the same network as attacker. And you can see the default gateway's MAC address ends in 1411, right? So now I'm moving to the actual attacker's host. And before you can do any ARP poisoning, you have to do you have to enable IP forwarding. Attacker's host is 10.0.0.13. And you will see on the left side that ARPSPOOF is being invoked with basically saying, okay, I'm going to attack the Windows host, which was .99, and I will ARP poison its default gateway. Okay, so I'm going to start TCP dump on the right side there, and that's listening for any traffic going to Google DNS, which in this case is 8.8.4.4, so that's a secondary Google DNS. And from the victim's host, performing the continuous ping to secondary Google DNS. As you see, there's no traffic that the attacker can see. Let's start ARP poisoning. Okay, so the moment ARP poisoning happens, so on the left side of the screen, you can see the two ARP poison messages that are being sent to the victim, right? And right now, if you remember that previous slide that was showing how attacker's in the middle and sees your traffic, that's what's going on. So I've stopped the ping and the packet capture has stopped. Continue the ping, packet capture continues, right? So basically right now, your attacker's machine, which is Kali, has visibility into all of the traffic from the victim's machine. And if you look at the ARP cache of the victim's machine, it changed to, the default gateway has changed to 73.BC. And then you can also see that that's the same MAC address as the attacker's MAC address, right? So this kind of gives out ARP attacks. When you see multiple MAC addresses in your ARP cache that are the same, you know that somebody is doing something funky, right? So it's important to mention too, like that what I've done is after ending the attack, I pressed Control-C in both of the ARP poisoning windows on the left side that have gracefully stopped the attack. And the reason why this is important is because after you're done with an attack, you don't want a victim to keep sending you the traffic, and then as you disconnect from the network, right, that's gonna black hole their, that's gonna affect their internet, so it's gonna break, right? So instead, this last several messages on the left side of the screen are just basically returning things to normal or unarping, if you will. So as a result, you see that victim has updated its default gateway's MAC address back to the original MAC, which is ends in D411. So anyway, so just to keep moving and make all the presentation material on time, this is how the ARP poisoning works in practice. All right, so we're using ARPSPOOF, so I'll show a couple other attacks to give you an idea. So what can you do? Once when you have that position of man in the middle and you see all of the victim's traffic, right, bidirectionally, one of the biggest flaws is if the victim is accessing any Cleartext protocols, which is definitely not the best practice in 2021 to be using protocols that are in clear. However, in actuality, we still see a lot of that going on, right? Especially when you're on the internal network, because people think, okay, yeah, this resource is behind the firewall, so meaning, you know, it can't be exploited or it's not vulnerable. Well, all what the attacker has to do is figure out the way how to be plugged into your network and then do this kind of thing. So anyways, if you're in man-in-the-middle situation, you can sniff FTP and HTTP and SNMP, SMB, RTP, TFTP, and all those protocols that are unencrypted by default. And there's a lot of meaningful information you can get from those, like usernames and passwords, and then you can go back and log in, right? You can sniff SNMP to get SMP secrets to actually get attack routers and switches, etc., right? There's also, I'm going to also show HTTPS proxy, there's still a way to actually break HTTPS. However, you will get a certificate error, but people are prone to just get in a habit, right, of clicking through things. And even though like the hope is that user will see that something has changed in the network, they'll get a warning and it will not proceed. I can attest that that doesn't happen at all times. So it's still worth of, even though like HTTPS is encrypted, right? It's still worth of running these attacks in certain situations, right? Then there's RDP Proxy. RDP is a big one. I would say that like throughout my pen testing experience, I've rarely, if not ever, haven't ever seen somebody signing the RDP sessions, meaning that in most situations, like users are just used to clicking through and accepting the cert that's self-signed, right? Which makes it also vulnerable to attack that I'm going to show. And then lastly, I'm going to show DNS spoofing attacks that are delivered from that man-in-the-middle situation. All right, so starting with sniffing Cleartext, on the left side of things, we have the attacker's host, which is Kali. And then on the right side of things, we have the victim host. It's the same host with that IP of 10.0.0.99. And then there is a web page that's just HTTP, so it's not encrypted, that the victim will access. So let's see what happens here. So for this attack, I'm using a tool called BetterCap, and it's intentionally designed, to do an advanced man-in-the-middle. It's pretty simple to use. So all what I'm saying is just poison the victim's traffic, and then do sniff the traffic in Cleartext, right? And then you'll see what happens when a victim goes to the website and just enters it creds. Basically, you see the full-on traffic, and you see the password. It's just demo and password for the sake of this presentation. And so just realize that when you're connected to your LAN, if you're accessing HTTP sites, this is how easy it is for an attacker to actually get your username and password. And then they can turn it around and just log in with it. All right, so I think that's pretty self-explanatory there. Okay, I'll move on. All right, the next attack is HTTPS proxy. Okay, so we have the similar type of situation here, attacker on the left side, victim host on the right side. And what I've done for the purpose of this attack is I went to a website that is HTTPS that had a certificate error that I've just decided to trust. So after I trusted this site, right, the system has remembered, that every time I connect to it, it's just going to accept the certificate, even though it may be a rogue one, right? So what happens there is I'm running the same BetterCap tool, and I'm doing proxy HTTPS and looking for all the post requests. So man-in-the-middle is active right now. Attacker sees the traffic, and I'm going to go to actually redteamcommunity.live, which is what we're using downstairs in a community area. And you can see how the website says it's not secure, right, in the web browser, but it didn't throw any certificate errors because I went in and I previously trusted this certificate. So that being said, now I'm I'm capturing an HTTPS session that's encrypted. It's going through the attacker's machine, which is basically creating a proxy for it. And you can see that, again, I was able to capture the username and password despite the fact that this traffic is encrypted. So the reason why I wanted to show this one is like when you're doing pen tests and you're on the internal network, a lot of times you will find that backend systems have self-signed certificates and they're SSL enabled. And what happens is that administrators will just trust these certificates because, that's a couple steps less involved than actually using PKI and and signing it with a public certificate, right? So with that being said, if you connect and you're doing either a pen test assessment or a red team exercise, I would look for those definitely. I would purposely try to man-in-the-middle access to the backend infrastructure with an intention to have the end users, in this case it would be administrators, trust certificates and just ignore the fact that there's that little warning that says not secure, which is kind of easy to miss though. All right, so RDP Proxy. So attackers on the left, the victim machine is on the right, basically connecting to it via RDP. This case, I'm using the tool called SET, and basically I'm telling it that to just intercept all of the RDP communication between the victim machine and the server. So here's where I'm providing the same credentials, and you'll see what happens. I get this certificate warning, click continue, because I'm in the habit of doing that. I don't know if this is a certificate that comes from attacker, or if this is a certificate that's from the RDP server itself. The RDP is going to log in, and I will get the Cleartext username and password, so you get the point. All right, here's one more. I gotta keep moving faster because of the time. This is an interesting one, like with DNS spoofing. So on the very left of your screen, you will see the ARP messages that are going to be sent, like both to your default gateway and the victim. Victim is actually going to be accessing a browser, and before man-in-the-middle and ARP spoofing, I'm using www.gnu.org, which is an HTML website, HTTP website. It's not encrypted. Starting ARP poisoning here. So now doing man-in-the-middle, basically, there's some things that you have to do to IP tables to prevent the real DNS request to go out. So that's what's happening on the top screen. And so your IP tables that get updated there, and I'm starting DNS spoof tool, which is basically going to respond. Instead of the real DNS, you will be providing the DNS resolution to the victim. And over there at the bottom, like I have the fake website that I've created, which is just a couple lines of HTML code that just says you have been hacked. And I'm going to start serving that with Python. So super simple, like takes a couple minutes to set. You can also clone web pages and then serve those instead. And for this attack to be successful, I have to go to the website that hasn't been locally cached in DNS. So I got to clear the DNS cache on the victim machine. So flushing DNS, and then you'll see what happens when we refresh that website. Going back to the same address, which is www.gnu.org. Unencrypted, says you have been hacked. So basically what happens right now is that attacker's machine is serving malicious DNS resolution to the victim, and then it's redirecting it to itself for website that it requested. All right, so I'm going to skip through this really quick. There are some more advanced attacks that are worth mentioning. SSL stripping, which basically takes your HTTPS channel and downgrades it to HTTP, which is in clear. A lot of sites are not vulnerable to this due to HSTS that has been a great control for this. Basically, there's a huge list of sites that you can only connect to with SSL. There's a way to circumvent this. The HSTS bypass modules exist in BetterCap tool, so you can do some testing for that, but in certain situations will work, in certain it will not. So even the SSL is not 100% bulletproof. You can do all sorts of things with SMB, where you can redirect the traffic. You can do HTML injections, and there are some capabilities to do man-in-the-middle attacks on IPv6. So, okay, I just wanted to conclude, share the red team's thoughts and like blue team's thoughts, and that should be end of my presentation. So From an attacker's viewpoint, I wouldn't use man-in-the-middle first. If you do attacks that are easier than this and a little less involved, I would go for those. Typically, we do man-in-the-middle attacks when we can't get credentials, through a regular means, and then we resort to it. Sometimes it can cause connectivity issues for end users. That's why mostly we try to stay away from it, but still using it pretty frequently. Most effective way is to ARP poison the gateway. That way you can get all of the network's traffic. You gotta be careful though, once when you have all of your nodes on a network routing through your machine, that can cause slowness and all sorts of issues. So safer approach is to do it one host at a time. When network is busy, there's a more chance for you to get a successful attack. And then after hours, it's also a good time to do this. All right, so here are some tools that have been used in this presentation. BetterCap, DSNIF, SET, and MITM. I put it up there because I think it's worth mentioning. It's a really great tool. And you can also see in the screen that Kali comes pre-built with a bunch of man-in-the-middle tools that you can just access from a desktop. All right, so blue team, what can you do about this? You can definitely use 802.1x and network access control, so you don't allow devices on the network that you don't trust to start. You can use dynamic ARP inspection if you're running Cisco switches. That's great control. It prevents this type of attacks. I've never seen it being used in practice. You can use static ARP entries if your network is small, mostly in the server environment. That's not dynamic. So if one of the servers gets compromised or somebody plugs into that, they can't poison ARP. And then also on the wireless networks, it's really easy to remediate this. You just want to enable client isolation, and that makes this type of attacks not function. You want to disable IPv6 if you're not using it, because there are some possibilities to do this with IPv6 just being enabled. Definitely encrypt your services and use VPN. Now for monitoring, you can use ARP Watch, which basically is going to throw an alert if it sees somebody doing ARP poisoning. So it's a really good tool. It's free, and then you can set it to alert your SIM. Also, you can look for anomalies, slowness, intermittent connectivity. If you see duplicate ARP entries in your cache, that should be a red light right there, and then you can proactively hunt for rogue devices connected to your network. If you see Raspberry Pis plugged in, ask yourself, is this supposed to be here? Anyways, that's all. I don't have much time for questions, but if there are any last-minute questions, happy to answer those. You can stop by the Red Team community downstairs in the exhibition area, and then you can find me there as well if you have any questions. Thank you.